There's a strange thing that happens to people who spend their whole lives trying to feel better. They never do, not in the way they imagined, not in the sustained, settled, finally arrived kind of way they were promised. They get moments, bright, fleeting, almost unbearably good moments. And then those moments dissolve, and they're left standing in the middle of their own lives, wondering why the feeling didn't stay, wondering what they did wrong, wondering if maybe they just need to try harder, want more specifically, or finally achieve that one thing they've been working toward. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Almost nobody says out loud. The chasing itself is part of the problem. Not because happiness is a myth, not because you're broken or incapable of joy, but because the very act of pursuing happiness, framing it as a destination, a reward, a thing to be earned and held, may be the most quietly exhausting trap the human mind has ever set for itself. This video is not about how to be happy. I want to be very clear about that from the beginning. This is about something stranger and more interesting. What happens to a person when they stop chasing it? What they find waiting there in the stillness, and why that discovery, for many people, turns out to be the closest thing to peace they've ever known. Think about how much of your inner life is organized around the future, not the practical future. Not schedules and grocery lists, but the emotional future. The imagined version of your life where things have finally settled, where you've arrived somewhere, where you wake up and there's no low-level hum of anxiety running beneath everything. No quiet dissatisfaction pressing against the inside of your chest like something trying to get out. Most people carry this image of a future self who is, at last, okay. Who is calm, who is confident, who has figured out the particular arrangement of circumstances that makes life feel worth living. And every day, they move toward that image, chasing it through productivity, through romance, through achievement, through the careful curation of experiences they believe will finally make them feel whole. This is not laziness. This is not stupidity. This is, in many ways, the most human thing in the world. But here is what that pattern quietly does to a person over time. It teaches you that the present moment is a problem to be solved rather than a life to be lived. It trains you to treat your current experience, with all its complexity and texture and strange beauty, as merely the waiting room before something better begins. And the more you live this way, the more transparent the present becomes, like a window. You look through rather than a place you actually stand. You stop tasting your food because you're thinking about the conversation you need to have tomorrow. You stop feeling the warmth of the people beside you because you're mentally rehearsing the version of yourself that will one day deserve that warmth. You stop noticing the particular quality of light on an afternoon in late autumn because you're too busy trying to manufacture the conditions you believe will make you happy. And then one day, maybe after a success that felt hollow, maybe after a relationship that was supposed to fix everything and didn't, maybe in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday that arrives with no ceremony whatsoever, you realize something has gone wrong. Not catastrophically, just quietly, persistently, deeply wrong. You have been so busy pursuing life that you forgot to live it. To understand why we do this, why the human mind organizes itself so fervently around the pursuit of something it can never quite hold, we need to go somewhere uncomfortable. We need to go into the architecture of the self. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who spent his life mapping the geography of the unconscious, believed that most of what drives human behavior is invisible to the person behaving. He called this the shadow, the vast, unexamined territory of the self that contains not only our fears and impulses, but also our unlived lives. The desires we suppressed because they seemed dangerous, the grief we never finished feeling, the parts of ourselves we decided, at some early and formative moment, were too much or not enough. Jung argued that when a person doesn't do the difficult work of integrating these hidden parts, when they keep running from what lives in the shadow, they will spend their entire lives in a kind of psychological displacement. They will reach outward, compulsively, for things that might quiet the interior noise. Money, status, love, pleasure, purpose. Not because these things are bad, they are not, but because they are being used as substitutes for the deeper reckoning the self keeps demanding. Happiness, in this framework, becomes a decoy, a shiny object the conscious mind fixates on to avoid confronting what the unconscious mind is actually trying to say. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher who is often considered the father of existentialism, described something he called the aesthetic stage of existence, a mode of living organized entirely around the pursuit of pleasure and stimulation. He watched people cycle endlessly through novelty, seeking experiences that would provoke some sensation of aliveness. And he noticed something devastating about this pattern. It works briefly, and then it stops working, and then the person needs more, a stronger sensation, a newer experience, a higher peak, and beneath all of that striving, quietly eroding everything, is what Kierkegaard called despair. Not the dramatic, weeping kind of despair, but the dull, persistent kind. The despair of a self that knows, on some level, it is not being fully inhabited. Arthur Schopenhauer took this further. He argued that desire itself is the source of human suffering, not because wanting things is immoral, but because the fundamental structure of desire is dissatisfaction. You want something, you don't have it. You suffer, you get it. The desire dissolves momentarily, and then, almost immediately, a new want rises to replace it. The wheel turns, and turns, and keeps turning. Schopenhauer wasn't preaching nihilism. He was describing a mechanism, a deeply human mechanism that almost no one examines closely enough to understand. And Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and emerged to write one of the most important psychological texts of the 20th century, added perhaps the most piercing observation of all. He said that happiness cannot be pursued. It must ensue. It is, in his words, a side effect, something that arrives naturally when a person is fully engaged with life, with meaning, with something larger than the self. The moment you make it a target, it recedes. It becomes like a shadow you try to step on. The faster you chase it, the faster it runs. What all of these thinkers are circling, from different angles and different centuries, is the same fundamental insight, the pursuit of happiness, when it becomes the organizing principle of a life, is a kind of trap. Not because happiness is unreal, but because the pursuit itself is built on a misunderstanding of what happiness actually is and where it actually lives. But knowing this doesn't make it easy to stop, and this is where it gets genuinely difficult. Because the pattern isn't just intellectual. It isn't a mistake you can correct by reading the right book or arriving at the right conclusion. It lives in the body. It lives in the nervous system. It is woven into the habits of attention that have been forming, quietly and persistently, since you were very young. Think about the tension you've felt between the life you're living and the life you believe you should be living. That gap. That relentless, nagging gap is not just frustration. It is an identity crisis in slow motion. Because buried inside the pursuit of happiness is a belief about who you need to become before you're allowed to feel at peace. And that belief, however unconscious it may be, is doing enormous damage. It tells you that your current self is inadequate, that the feelings you have right now, the ambivalence, the confusion, the quiet longing that doesn't even have a name, are problems to be fixed rather than experiences to be felt. It tells you that genuine peace is something you have to earn through a long enough sequence of correct choices. And so, you live in the strange limbo of a life on hold. Present enough to function, but never quite fully here. Always oriented toward somewhere else. Always waiting for the version of yourself that will have finally resolved the tension. Jean-Paul Sartre called this bad faith. The tendency of human beings to deceive themselves about the nature of their own freedom, to pretend that their lives are being shaped by forces outside their control, by circumstances, by fate, by the gap between who they are and who they need to become, rather than confronting the vertiginous truth that they are, at every moment, responsible for the meaning they assign to their existence. This is not comfortable. Freedom, in the existentialist sense, is not the pleasant freedom of a Sunday afternoon. It is the terrifying freedom of realizing there is no script, no cosmic guarantee that the pursuit will be rewarded, no authority waiting to confirm that you've finally done enough, felt the right things, become the right person. And it is precisely this terror, this encounter with the open, unguaranteed nature of existence, that sends most people running back into the chase. Because the chase, however exhausting, at least gives the impression of direction. It at least provides the comforting illusion that you know where you're going, even if you never quite arrive. So what happens when someone stops? not gives up, not collapses in defeat, not abandons ambition or withdraws from life, but genuinely, thoughtfully, stops organizing their entire inner life around the project of feeling better in some imagined future, and turns their attention, for perhaps the first time, fully toward what is actually here. It tends to happen in one of two ways. Either something forces the stop, an illness, a loss, a failure, so total that the chase simply becomes impossible, or a person reaches, through their own reflection and exhaustion, the quiet recognition that the system isn't working, that the ladder they've been climbing doesn't lean against the wall they thought it did. And what they typically find in that first moment of stopping is not peace. They find discomfort. They find all of the feelings they have been outrunning, the grief they never finished, the boredom they were terrified to sit with, the strange, vertiginous absence of the striving that had, for so long, given their days a sense of momentum. They find the present moment raw and unfiltered and not especially pleasant, and their first instinct is to reach back toward the chase. This is the critical moment. This is the threshold, because what lies on the other side of that discomfort, not around it, not above it, but through it, is something most people spend their entire lives trying to purchase through external achievement. And it cannot be purchased. It can only be entered. Philosophers in the Stoic tradition, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, spoke at length about what they called amor fati, the love of fate. Not a passive resignation to whatever life brings, but an active, even fierce embrace of reality as it is, not as you wish it were, not as it will be once you've fixed it, but as it actually, presently, undeniably is. This is a radical idea, more radical, in some ways, than anything the self-help industry has ever offered, because it doesn't promise improvement. It doesn't promise that life will get easier or more pleasant or more aligned with your desires. It says something both simpler and more demanding, that life is already real, already here, already yours, and that the refusal to inhabit it fully is the source of more suffering than any external circumstance. Friedrich Nietzsche, who is often misread as a thinker of ambition and power, was, at his deepest, a philosopher of affirmation. His concept of the eternal recurrence, the thought experiment that asks whether you would be willing to live your life again, exactly as it was, infinite times, is not a statement about metaphysics. It is a challenge to the quality of your relationship with existence. Could you say yes to your life? Not the idealized version, not the life with the better decisions and the avoided mistakes and the happiness finally achieved. This life, these exact days, this exact texture of being, most people, if they are honest, cannot say yes. And Nietzsche's point is that this inability, this refusal, is where the real work of being human begins. When someone genuinely begins to shift their relationship with happiness, not as a concept but as a lived practice, something subtle and profound starts to change. The first thing that changes is attention. When you stop orienting your inner life toward a future where things will finally be okay, you suddenly have attention available for what is actually happening. This sounds simple. It is not simple at all. Most people have never truly directed their full, undivided, non-evaluative attention toward their own experience. They have observed it, judged it, tried to improve it, tried to escape it, but just being with it, just allowing the texture of a moment to exist without immediately measuring it against some internal standard of how it should feel. This is profoundly unfamiliar. And what people often discover, in that unfamiliar stillness, is that experience is far richer than the pursuit of happiness ever allowed them to notice. That even difficult emotions, sadness, uncertainty, longing, have a strange, almost beautiful quality when they are met with openness rather than resistance. That the ordinary fabric of a day contains more genuine aliveness than most peak experiences engineered through deliberate pursuit. The second thing that changes is the relationship with the self. When happiness is no longer a project you are failing to complete, the inner critic, that relentless voice that measures and finds lacking, loses some of its authority. Not because it goes silent, it rarely does, but because its premise has been removed. It can no longer tell you that you are behind, that you should be further along, that the fact of your continued imperfection is evidence of fundamental inadequacy. because you have stopped agreeing that perfection was ever the point. Jung called this process individuation, the gradual, often painful movement toward becoming who you actually are, as opposed to who you believed you needed to become. It is not a triumphant process. It does not look like the achievement of a long-sought goal. It looks more like a slow unclenching, like the gradual release of a tension you had held for so long. You stopped feeling it as tension and started experiencing it as simply the way things are. And the third thing, perhaps the most important and the hardest to articulate, is the emergence of what Frankl called meaning, not manufactured meaning. Not the meaning you assign to your life in order to make the pursuit feel worthwhile, but the kind of meaning that arises naturally, organically. When a person stops trying to feel a certain way and starts simply paying attention to what genuinely matters to them. This is strange to sit with, because our culture teaches us that meaning is something you find, that it is out there, waiting, and your job is to locate it through the right combination of experience and effort. But Frankl, who lost nearly everything in the camps and still found himself capable of interior freedom, argued something different. He said that meaning is not found, it is created, or perhaps more precisely, it is recognized in the particular way you orient yourself toward whatever life places in front of you. You do not need to be happy to create meaning. You do not need the circumstances to cooperate. You need only to be honest about what you genuinely value, not what you think you should value, not what the culture has told you to value, but what, in the quietest and most honest room of yourself, actually matters to you, and then to act from that place with full presence. This is not the same as happiness, but it is something more durable than happiness. It is, for lack of a better word, groundedness, a quality of being rooted in your own life, in your own values, in your own moment-to-moment experience, in a way that doesn't depend on feeling good, a way of being that can coexist with difficulty, with uncertainty, with the full spectrum of human emotion, because it is not organized around the avoidance of discomfort. It is organized around something deeper. There is a paradox at the center of all of this that I think is worth sitting with for a moment before we close. The people who seem most genuinely at peace, not the performatively happy, not the relentlessly optimistic, but the quietly, deeply settled, tend to be people who have, at some point, made their peace with the possibility that peace might never fully arrive. People who have stopped waiting for the internal weather to clear before they agree to fully inhabit their lives. People who have, in some essential way, accepted the terms of their own existence, including all of its uncertainty, all of its impermanence, all of its refusal to resolve into the clean and satisfying shape they once imagined it would. This is not resignation. I want to be careful here, because there is a version of this idea that tips into passivity, a kind of philosophical defeat dressed up as enlightenment. That is not what I'm pointing toward. The people I mean are not passive. They are, in many ways, more fully engaged with life than those still caught in the relentless chase, because they are actually here, they are actually present. They are no longer spending their inner resources on the maintenance of an imagined future. What shifts when the chase slows is not ambition, it is anxiety. It is the particular flavor of suffering that comes from treating your own existence as a problem to be solved. Maybe this is what the contemplative traditions, Buddhism, Stoicism, certain strands of mystical Christianity, the quieter corners of existentialism, have been pointing at for centuries, in their different languages and metaphors. Not that suffering is good, not that you should want less or dream smaller, but that the suffering which comes from refusing to be where you are, from perpetually orienting the deepest part of yourself toward a destination that keeps receding, is, in some profound sense, optional, not easy to release, not simple to relinquish, but optional. Because here is what I think is actually true, and what I think most people sense, in their quieter moments, before the noise of the pursuit drowns it out again. You are not waiting to arrive somewhere. You are already somewhere. You have always been somewhere, this exact moment, with its imperfections and its texture and its strange, unearned beauty and its losses and its ordinary human weight. This is the life, not the rehearsal, not the waiting room, the life itself. And the great tragedy is not that life is hard, or short, or filled with loss. The great tragedy, the one that is actually preventable, is that most people spend the majority of their waking hours somewhere other than in it. Mentally, somewhere else. Emotionally, on hold. Present in body, but absent in spirit. Waiting for a signal that never quite comes. A feeling that never quite stays. An arrival that keeps getting pushed to the next chapter. What happens when you stop chasing happiness? You begin, perhaps for the first time, to notice what was always already here. Not happiness. Exactly. Something quieter than happiness. Something that doesn't need the circumstances to cooperate. Something that was waiting beneath the noise of the pursuit all along. Patient, undemanding, asking only that you stop running long enough to feel it. I don't know what to call that something. The traditions have many names for it. Presence, stillness, grace, the ground of being, the self behind the self. But I think you know what I mean. I think you have felt it. In the moments between striving, in the unexpected stillness of an ordinary afternoon, in the strange peace that sometimes arrives after a long cry, when everything has been emptied out, and you are left with something clear and simple that you can't quite name, but somehow recognize. That is not the result of the chase. That is what you find when you stop.